Hello. I think we are live. We got there in the end. Thanks for bearing with us, everybody. Welcome to this very special Mad Masters session with Rory and Tom Bridges from Herdify. How are you doing, guys? You well?
Yeah, not too bad. I had a sort of 60th birthday yesterday, so I'm slightly recovering, although I didn't drink very much because I'm 60 and you can't anymore. The hangovers just last too long. It's too painful. It's not worth it.
Well, I'm sure everybody would.
But
like
do you have a
to,
senior rail card? Though I can show you my. I might actually show
let's
you
have
my
a look.
senior rail card. Yeah. By the way, this is absurd, right? Because you kind of go, you're 60, you probably paid off your mortgage, your kids have left home, right? You don't have that many expenses anymore, but why don't we give you a third off rail travel? There should really be a rail card for people in their 30s and 40s who, this is nonsense. But there you go, that's my senior rail card, albeit in virtual form.
You've got to take the perks when you can get them, Rory. So,
you can, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And people are wishing you happy birthday over the chat. 60 years of excellence from Welsh Multi. So yeah, I saw the photos, Rory. It looked like showbiz. It was brilliant.
Where was that? Where were the photos from?
Oh, I saw Anna on Facebook. She posted
Brilliant.
some photos. Jimmy was there. Yeah. So,
oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So
absolutely super.
We've got a great chat lined up today. Tom is somebody who we at MadFest have collaborated with many times.
Absolutely, and rightly so.
You guys have done some great sessions together, and Tom's work and his view on the world, I think, is very much informed by lots of the ideas and thinking that people will have received in the course so far. But just in case anybody on the call doesn't know Tom or Herdify, Tom, could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and what Herdify does?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that worries me Rory's intro is if hangovers are bad at 60, I already think they're terrible in my mid 40s. So I'm getting even more nervous. Already. So yeah, what do we do? So Herdify, really what we do is we help brands leverage the fact that a big influence in human decision making is people around us, aka herd mentality, which is why we sort of sit alongside the herd mentality module of the course. What that means in reality is we help brands see where offline conversations are happening. So it's not social media listening. We're trying to see where that offline social influence, so they can use that in any sort of form of marketing or advertising. The way I think about the world is, so I think of society as like got this hidden cobweb underneath, this huge complex spider web of relationships that connect us all in different ways that we can't see. And that cobweb, it doesn't, you still need to be fantastic at marketing. So everything else you learn on this course is really important. But that hidden web can either give you a superpower in terms of acceleration, or it can provide huge inertia. So that's kind of what we help expose to give people that advantage. How it works, cover that very quickly, because often in these, that'll be the first question we get at the end of the session. Best analogy is to think about how a virus spreads. So our background in, during the pandemic, we worked with the UK government to predict where the virus was going to spread to. That meant we could build staff rosters from areas that were least likely to be infected to reduce the chance of an outbreak in a government facility. The same maths and science that allows you to predict the spread of a virus allows you to predict the spread, the keyword is spread, of influence between people. So we built a tool that allows us to do that and deliver those insights, which basically allows marketing teams to acquire customers who are faster, but also better quality. Probably talked about it with Rory before, but if people around us have a certain behavior or buy a certain product and we buy it, we're less likely to churn. So it just means we become more loyal as customers, not loyal to the brand, loyal to the behavior of people around us. So.
And actually, a very important, I didn't realize this, a very important thing about social contagion is that it's non-linear, or rather it's supralinear at a certain point. So you have any behavior which is, it's weird, okay? Yeah. And my argument is this is actually ecologically rational, because as humans, we've evolved two very strong default modes: do what I've done before and do what everybody else is doing. And it's perfectly sensible. May not be optimal, but as a way of avoiding disaster, which is the most important thing in evolution, it's actually very sensible. If everybody else is doing it, it's probably okay, particularly if they've been doing it for some time. And if I've done it before, it's probably okay because I'm still alive to contemplate doing it again.
Yeah.
And so I always say, if you've eaten lots of purple berries, but you've never eaten a yellow berry, stick with the purple berries unless you're starving. And similarly, if you find yourself in an unusual place and everybody's eating the purple berries, but nobody touches the yellow berries, then eat the purple berries because they probably know something you don't. So any organism that didn't have these two default modes would be at a big evolutionary disadvantage. It's really, really sensible. But what's interesting about it is that when I say it's supralinear, you reach thresholds where something goes from weird, whether it's air fryer ownership or having solar panels or driving an electric car, you have that early stage. It's called the Bass diffusion curve. That's why it's called the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. The Bass is the Bass diffusion curve. You have that point where a behavior no longer makes you feel awkward, either socially or individually. And interestingly, colleagues of mine at, I think it was Wavemaker within WPP, that's why they started out electric cars as a big fleet and company car benefit, because their idea was you have to get this shit to 10%. Okay, and that's the fastest way to get to 10%.
Yeah.
Because suddenly when 10% of people have an electric car, you might be a bit of an outlier, but you're no longer a weirdo. Whereas if you owned an electric car, 10 years ago, if you had a Nissan Leaf 15 years ago, you're a real weirdo.
Yeah.
And and also if your electric car ran out of juice and you were stranded in Dorset, everybody laughed at you. So there are also social consequences to being weird as well. And so what's so interesting about Herdify is, in a sense, what you can do is you can concentrate advertising resources at a point where the behavior is about to tip. And it's a sigmoid curve, the Bass diffusion curve, and it's basically slow, quick, slow. So in other words, something is very slow to be adopted, then it hits the threshold of normality, where more and more people adopt it. Those people then like what they've adopted and they keep it as a habit. You see?
Yep.
And then eventually you reach an asymptote where everybody who wants to do the thing is doing it already. And so something like dishwasher ownership, it's really, really slow. I mean, the UK still has lower dishwasher ownership than Turkey, for example, partly because we've got small kitchens and loads of constraints. But that's the kind of thing which will start off really, really. My grandparents owned the 4th dishwasher in Wales.
It's still only 5, isn't it?
It still works. It was built in New Zealand in 1959, I think, and it still works. Okay, we're probably going to send it to a museum, in fact, cool. And a museum of Welsh domestic appliances or something.
Yeah,
innovation. Yeah. But it's very interesting because all these things, and so one of the great things you can do is if you can find the areas where the behavior is getting close to that sort of inflection point, I think you get literally you've kind of hit pay dirt. You get your advertising's doing like triple duty.
Yeah. And what I love there about the Bass diffusion curve is most people do that analysis on their company at a national or a global level, which therefore most people spend most of their time at the bottom. Most people don't hit that kind of point of breakout velocity. But when you can kind of spot it at regional or in a smaller area, actually different areas will be much further along on the curve. And they basically act as the tinder for the rest of the curve nationally to spread. So, it allows you to be more selective, more strategic with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, by the way, it's the reason this is one of the things that marketers sort of know about, which nobody else does. And I think it's the most important thing that you as a marketer, maybe not the most, but one of the 3 most important things you can tell non-marketing colleagues, because I literally think there were really, really big ideas like Google Glass where they just quit too soon.
Mm-hmm.
Someone should have said, look, this Google Glass thing, it's a 10-year, this is a 10-year investment. And what they did is they said, ooh, people are being called glass holes. It's not very popular. People are finding it really difficult. Da, 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 da. And then a year later, they go, okay, we'll quit. We'll abandon the category. I hate to say it, but I think that actually Zuckerberg, I would prefer this idea came from almost anybody else. But I think his bet with Ray-Ban on the augmented reality specs is probably the best current tech bet anybody's making, provided you stick it out for 10 years.
Or bring in Herdify and find the right areas and scale them.
Well, I'm sure our viewers will have lots of comments on that. And we were trying out the Ray-Bans in the MadFest offices this week. Very, very impressive bit of kit. But we've got a bunch of questions to get through. The questions are already coming through on the Q&A function as well. So if you do want to ask a question, we'll get to those at the end. But Tom, I just wanted to ask your opinion about something. I actually got out of the office this week and I went to an event as a punter, which was really, really odd for me. I sort of feel compelled to help out and stuff like that. But but obviously there was lots of conversation about AI and the sort of everybody chasing this AI dream. But the rhetoric seems to be same but different. Everything changes, but nothing changes. I wanted to ask your opinion on the things that don't change. Have you got an opinion on the things that we can leverage that don't change in all of this chaos that we're experiencing?
Yeah, and the reason I love the question, Dan, is it's something that if you ever hear me talk, I utter this too often, is the fact, and it's a Jeff Bezos quote. He famously says, everyone's always asking him what's going to be the next big thing. He says, but he rarely gets asked the question of what's not going to change, because he said, I can't build a business around what's going to change, but I can build a business about what's going to stay the same. And for me, I look at the same with what we're talking about today with understanding consumer behavior. Let's not forget 3 years ago, we were all going to be living in a metaverse, trading everything on a blockchain. And then this year it's AI. Now, I think AI has got a bit more staying power than those other technologies. But the point being is, if you're trying to build your marketing function or your business around technology, we don't know what's going to be there. That's going to bring huge swathes of anxiety and misunderstanding. If you can understand human behavior, which never say never, it will change. It just changes at a glacial pace. It actually means when the technologies shift, you can evaluate those technologies against what you're trying to do with human behavior, as opposed to technology for technology's sake. And I think that's what causes a lot of anxiety and confusion, frankly, in this AI world we now live in.
And it's very interesting, Rory. By the way, you mentioned Jeff, because I always describe Jeff as the world's richest behavioral scientist, which he is. And so he always mentions that thing that there will never be a time when people don't like fast delivery, and there'll never be a time when people don't like low prices. Although I would take issue with him on the second one, because farmers markets and luxury goods actually prove that wrong. But nonetheless, people like to feel they've got a bargain, put it that way. And they like to feel they've got a good deal, and they like things delivered quickly. Jeff also says, bet on the things that are far out, because nobody else has the patience to bet on those things. If you're just betting on what you might call short-term, rapid return improvements, generally you're doing something which lots of your competitors are doing. If you do make a sort of a bet that takes time to pay off, and this just led me to an interesting observation on transport policy. So when I was growing up, I lived in Welsh Walty, I love all this shit. I lived in Raglan, and there was an A road, 2-lane road that went to Abergavenny, the A40. And they replaced it with a dual carriageway. And almost immediately, everybody stopped taking the A road and they took the dual carriageway. That's a thing that requires very small amounts of behavioural change, because people were already going between Raglan and Abergavenny, and you provided them with a faster way of doing it, so they took the new road, not the old road. And that's what you might call a low level of innovation, because it allows people to do the same thing in a slightly different way. If you take High Speed 1, and now I grew up by this stage, I was living in Sevenoaks, and they opened High Speed 1. And every now and then, I did it this morning, when I need to get anywhere in North London, I drive to Ebbsfleet and take the High Speed 1 train in. Now, what was interesting is for the first 5 or 6 years of High Speed 1, no one was using it. I was, because I'm a train nerd. But I would literally have a carriage to myself on some of those journeys. Now, the bloody train's rammed, because it takes 6 or 7 years for people to learn a new behaviour, which is like living in Margate and working in London. for example, or going down to Margate, for a day at the beach because it doesn't take 2 hours anymore. But so the interesting thing is that if we're not careful, if we don't understand this diffusion curve, we'll invest a lot in not very important innovations, like the same thing but slightly better, and we'll underinvest in things which are a totally new thing. But in the long term, it's high-speed one that's really, really valuable, and the dual carriage, the dueling of the A40 between Raglan and Abergavenny, nice though it is, and quick though it was to appear to pay off, actually wasn't that important. So things like, I'll give you an example of that. The best example, I think the first network business in the world was the Penny Post, Royal Mail. And it lost money for the first 3 years because nobody knew anybody in fucking Glasgow. They could write, very nice to know that you could write to someone in Glasgow for a penny. But since no one had ever done it because they assumed that writing to someone in Glasgow would cost, a guinea or something, right? Nobody adopted the behavior. It took about 5 years for people to go, oh, that's interesting. I could actually, write to someone in Glasgow. And so the really important innovations, solar panels, etc., all those things actually are really, really slow. And the unimportant innovations are really, really quick. And so I think that it's a really important question to understand this, that the bigger, so I always used to think as an ad guy that, look, if you've got a really great product, right, you don't need to advertise it much because everyone will just buy it. And then I realized, no, the really great products require a lot of behavioral change, and humans find behavioral change difficult, so you've got to market them a lot. And that would even apply, the mobile phone, for fuck's sake. I mean, the most obvious fucking idea, everybody'd seen them on Star Trek. Right, here's this brilliant idea, which is I don't have to be at home next to a wire to make a phone call or for someone to reach me. Now, the weird thing is, when we look back on history, we tend to think they didn't have mobile phones, then they invented them, so we all bought them. It wasn't like that at all. It was literally 15 to 20 years of people getting their heads around the idea.
Yeah.
So Tom, tell me a little bit about, back to the things that don't really change. What's your view of how we make decisions? Is that, does that ever change, or does it fundamentally it's the same rules apply? Curious to know your view on that.
Yeah, as I say, I think it's if you're going to make bets, at least I think it's relatively stable, and it really leads to a soapbox thing that I'm sort of championing at the moment. And I should frame this really as I'm not an anti-tech guy. Like the last person that paid me a salary was Microsoft. 20 years ago, I did neural networks as part of my degree. So I've been in and around tech for a long time, but my constant theme is tech for the sake of tech doesn't help anybody move forward. And, we're seeing people talk about chief AI officers and all of these things. And actually, for me, that's the technology. That's going to change. We don't know, that's not focused on an outcome. That's not focused on something we can build a long-term plan around. So I'm sort of championing the cause for the chief advocacy officer, where someone in the business owns that kind of advocacy piece. I was fortunate enough this week to be down with Kent and Surrey and Sussex Air Ambulance talking around advocacy. Yeah. Got my little calendar they gave me for attending. But the point of the day was, we had smart people in the room talking about how we can use advocacy to build a plan for them for 5 years. It's not cheap to run, aircraft. And it was just fascinating to see so many smart people in the room. Once the concepts there that advocacy is powerful, that people take hold of it. And we talked about technology, but it was how technology can help as part of fueling advocacy to fuel the growth of the charity. But what's important, and like I'm sure you've all been through millions of workshops in your career, is when you leave these things, you need someone who's going to own and sponsor these through the business, because if you don't, they turn into great conversations, but with no strategic support around the board table. So therefore, AI will be adopted because you've got a chief AI officer, but will it deliver business value? Advocacy will deliver value, but does it have a stakeholder sitting around the table?
This is, by the way, one of the most interesting things, which is things that are fucking expensive tend to have loads of stakeholders.
Yeah.
And things that aren't expensive. So I always ask my friend Charlie Hills in Mando Connect, they're a brand partnerships agency. Right. Everything they do works, okay? It's always brilliant. It's ingenious, but it doesn't cost very much. So I said, why are you such a small business? I don't understand why you're only 15 people. This is brilliant, right? This is like marketing magic. He said, well, because it doesn't cost very much. Typically, all the organizations we deal with either have nobody or one person in charge of brand partnerships. Whereas if it's something really expensive, like media, right, you've got tons and tons of people around it. So there's this total distortion that the things that actually work really, really super efficiently don't actually get much internal support because they're not seen as expensive enough to deserve attention. It's completely whack.
And it's a bit like, you know, we talked about with fame briefly. Everyone wants to have an officer. If I'm a chief AI officer on LinkedIn, everyone's like, oh, I know what that is. AI is this big weird thing, and he's the chief AI. That means he must be a super serious person. Whereas if you're looking after something that's not, when you're at the dinner party and people say, what do you do for a living? And you're like, they just sort of go, oh. And that's important, right? Our social status is driven by what our job title is in a lot of places.
I mean, I jokingly said I wanted to start an ad agency which just focused on really unfashionable things that work really well. And we sort of brand partnerships, branded merch. Branded merch. I'd have a head of branded merch, right? Because some people love your brand. Allow them to express, you know, I jokingly said I love London City Airport so much. If there were a London City Airport bear, I'd go fucking buy it, right? Okay. And so, you know, there are these things which are just gloriously effective, but in a weird way, they're almost a victim of their own success.
Funny enough, Rory, I was in a charity shop in Northumberland recently, and saw that they were selling, you know, the AO bears that you get when you buy a dishwasher or something.
Oh yes, AO. Yeah, they were selling them in the shop.
10 quid for an AO bear. So
wow.
They actually only cost £1 to make. So that's a high margin opportunity.
Somebody is making some money. You two have worked on hundreds, if not thousands, of campaigns in your lives. I mean, the shift towards considering psychology and how we make decisions, is this a big change for brands to make? Is there anything that they can do right now that will help them to make more decisions that are tuned into the way that
one thing, I'm really proud of the fact that Ogilvy has pretty much the largest influencer business, online influencer business in the UK. And I see that as actually the future of a large part of digital advertising, because it's contextualized messaging. Okay, a person is delivering a recommendation, which is totally different, or just showing that they use something. Doesn't really matter, you know. And I think the potency of that compared to most digital advertising is a shelf wobbler without a shelf. It's like an appeal to a transaction that appears to you with no context at a totally irrelevant moment when you're not necessarily in the right mindset. And I think it's very efficient in delivering messages to a person, but appallingly bad at delivering message in terms of the extra added value you gain from your messaging. It's all about targeting and not about persuasion, which is kind of dumb, right? You know, I'd much rather be all about persuasion and less about targeting if you've got to lean one way or the other. And so understanding, I think, the fact that behavior is contagious, and I suppose influencers are super spreaders, aren't they? Potentially.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask Tom, have you looking at the effects, not only at a geographical level, which is obviously very important for visibly consumed goods of any or visibly manifested behaviors, and have you, you know, and by the way, I think new behaviors form in pockets. You know, something like naturism, you need to create a space, okay, where it's normal.
Yeah.
See what I mean? Yeah. If you wouldn't have much fun being the only naturist in Sevenoaks. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You'd basically be known as Pervy Dave, and no one would allow their kids anywhere near you. But if you create a beach, you know, you're starting to make progress.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you know, I'm really intrigued about. Obviously, geography is really, really important here because you know there are many, many products which are advertisements for themselves. You know, very, very good idea putting the green flash on electric car rear number plates.
Yeah.
You know, there are lots of good reasons for that, but that, you know, that was a clever idea. But do you also look at sort of influencers? So do you say, look, there is this weird pocket of people who watch this?
We don't look directly, but we sort of the behaviours being considered, because for me, there's two parts actually I'm looking at the influencer journey, because we started with famous influencers, right? And then we've trickled down to these micro influencers.
Yeah.
I think with the rise of AI, that might kill that lower end, because once we can't discern the difference between an AI influencer and a micro influencer who we don't know, it becomes an ad, which therefore makes famous influencers more valuable again, right? So
yeah.
I'm intrigued to see. That's my prediction. But then look at, you know, if we look at how these influencers spread things, it's alongside offline behavior, not in spite of it. So
it is.
A good example. So my daughters are huge into horse riding. They wear this brand called Lemure.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, you poor thing.
Yeah,
it's so fucking expensive. I mean,
God,
seriously.
yeah. No,
I mean, oh my God. And then it costs you a fortune if they die, because you've got to take the bloody dead horse away.
Well, thankfully, we loan a horse. We don't own it.
Oh, fine. Okay. I'm sorry.
At least 2 days a week, effectively.
Because when my daughters were really young, I used to show them pictures of horses and then give them electric shocks, basically, just to discourage them.
I wish we had this conversation 10 years ago. But yes, but even the clothing. So they buy this brand Lemure. It's a great brand. They love it. But all of the girls in the stable wear it. Now, they watch this. I can't bear the program, but it's called Harlow and Popcorn on YouTube. It's a YouTube influencer. Now Harlow got, and I was watching there, and she got some new clothing for her birthday from a new brand that I'd never heard of, my daughter had never heard of. So she's an influencer seeing a new brand. So I jokingly said to her, I said, okay, so I guess that's now on your Christmas list then. And she sort of thought, went, no, I'll stick with Lemure. And I'm looking at her thinking, it's great the influencer's doing it, but because no one in her stable is doing it, she's going to look like the odd one out. So we need, and we've talked about this before, but it's about 6% of us make those independent decisions. So that means there's probably one person in her stable that would have seen that and might adopt it. When they've done it, it opens up the gate for everyone else. So influencers are great. They plant seeds, but without the offline adoption, it can stall. So you sort of need to layer the two, ideally.
And following on from that, I wanted to have a chat with you both about the Labubu craze. You know, those sort of cute little soft toys that every Gen Alpha wants to clip onto their rucksack. You know, it seems like her behaviour must have contributed to the rise and the popularity of that, and how it's become a cultural phenomenon. Have you got a take on that, Tom?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what I've just said. That those things are, TikTok's brilliant, right? And I'm not against any of these social platforms, but it has to mimic what's going on in real life. Like literally, I went to get a cup of tea before this recording, and my daughter's got a non-uniform day tomorrow. My wife ordered some of these new fashionable trousers from Next that were due to be here for lunchtime today. We've got an email saying they're not going to be here, and we know the meltdown that's going to cause, right? Because if you go to school and all of your friends are wearing these baggy hoodie or baggy jogging bottoms and you're not, you're the odd one out. And it's the same with the Labubu. Most people are not confident enough to be the first person to bring it in, but once their friends are, that bass diffusion curve, it goes like, you know, a rocket, and that's, you know, that's the bit. Now, what I think we always need to think of is everyone talks about these breakout successes on social. No one talks about the other millions of products that are on social at the moment having absolutely no traction, right? And I'm not saying this is the only reason, but these underlying social structures help us understand why some things do get breakout. There's lots of other brilliant products on TikTok, let's be honest, right? There's probably better products than Labubu, if I'm honest with you, but just don't have that same success. So therefore, me, it's really, how do you layer that? And we try and advise people, like, you know, find influences in areas where word of mouth is strong. We'll tell you where word of mouth is strong. You find the influencer, but they then have a natural amplification of each other, as opposed to having to do the hard work on its own. Unless you're famous enough that you can afford Keira Knightley, then that's a different job, right? But most people can't afford Keira Knightley.
Rory,
there's an interesting bit of advice here, which is how you can maximize the chance of virality of any experience or behavior. And there's an agency in the States which refers to something as a brand quake, which is a moment in customer experience which is so impressive that you basically A, become super loyal as a result, and B, talk about it.
Yeah.
And the example I found fascinating is that I think your telephone call center has the potential to create talkable moments. So I had one with hotels.com. Apologies if you've heard this before, but my father-in-law got ill before we were due to go on holiday. I managed to sort of reschedule the flights, and I tweaked the dates of the Airbnb, and the Airbnb guy was very nice and gave me a few days of money back, and just, he didn't really have to, but he did. And then hotels.com got in touch with the hotel, and they said, I'm afraid it's a 48-hour cancellation policy, and I'd stupidly left it a bit too late. And they said, well, look, we can't do anything this weekend because the hotel manager isn't in and he'd need to sanction a refund. And on Monday, they got back to me, hotels.com. This is on live chat, and said, I'm terribly sorry, but the hotel manager said, since it was after 48 hours, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, fair enough, you've done your best. Okay, I was kind of my fault. I was thinking about the flights and everything else, and I kind of forgot about the 2 days hotel at the beginning. That was it. Okay. And then 3 days later, the guy from hotels.com gets back in touch with me and said, I thought you were treated a bit unfairly there. So I got back in touch with the hotel. I imagine hotels.com have quite a bit of kind of, look, don't fuck with us. Yeah. Okay. But nonetheless, I got back in touch with the hotel, and they've refunded the first night.
Brilliant.
Now I'm like, what the actual fuck? In other words, we closed this call as far as I was concerned. I wasn't an angry customer. I was perfectly, accepting of the situation. And you went to the extra mile and did something you didn't need to do. And I'm just like, right, well, I know I'm booking with next time. And I'm telling you now, because it's sufficiently impressive that it's talkable. Yeah. And I genuinely think that you can, there are decisive moments of customer experience which can be turned into advocacy. And we're not looking for them. And the reason is they're hard to measure. That's as simple as that. And most people in business are in the business of justifying their own existence through self-serving short-term metrics. They're not in the business of building long-term brand value or advocacy, indeed.
I was going to say, I love that, because it doesn't make sense. That person shouldn't have spent extra time on it.
No, and that's precisely why I went, whoa.
Yeah. And that's what I mean, like, back to my harping on about my soapbox, but because no one in the business is tasked with thinking about making advocacy count. There's no one, that's just I bet that's probably an exception rather than the rule in that business. I could be proven wrong, I'd like to be, but that's just a smart person that's thought that's the wrong thing. That was a shit experience.
The wrong solution. Yeah.
I need to find out more about that, because they're owned by Expedia. Yeah. And I need to find, there's a guy, very, very experienced guy, one of the consulting firms who specializes in customer service. And he said there's one heuristic rule which distinguishes a service-led company from a company that treats service as a cost. And he said it's very simple. It's whether the call center staff are allowed to call out. Right. If they're allowed to call out to follow up on something, or you get cut off in the middle of the call and they call you back. Okay, basically those companies are really good at customer service. The companies where it basically goes, we can't possibly, we're going to make the minimal effort we possibly can to get this bastard off the line, are unsurprisingly shit at it. I don't know, a car dealer recently in Ashford in Kent, I rang up, there was no reply, it was a Saturday, I thought that's a bit crap. And then 20 minutes later, he rings back and he said, I'm sorry, I was outside with a customer, it's just me here today. I noticed a missed call, so is there anything I can do for you?
Great.
Now, the weird thing about that is we've had calling line identity in businesses, and the ability to log incoming calls for like 25 years.
Yeah.
That's only the second time it's ever happened to me where someone notices a missed call and bothers to ring back.
Yeah.
Now, how weird is that? Really strange.
My version of that is brands that email you with a do not reply from a do not reply email address. How to tell me that you don't want to engage with me more that make it difficult for me to respond to your email.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely unbelievable. I mean, if they said do not reply directly, but if you have any further problems, forward to, that's just about okay. I get it that you can't, you can't. But I mean, the interesting one is James Dyson. I spoke to someone at JLR who worked with Dyson for many years, and when they presented the call center sort of efficiency statistics to him, Dyson just interrupted halfway through and said, I don't care about any of this stuff. He said, as far as I'm concerned, if one of our customers wants to ring us up, we should treat it as an honor and we should respond accordingly.
Nice. I like that.
Their customer service is, by the way, fantastic, which is the entire reason why my dad ended up with 3 Dysons. Because with his first Dyson, he had some sort of weird problem. I can't remember what it was, missing part, or, you couldn't make the nodule that does the curtains fit into whatever it was. Anyway, he rang up. They just sent a replacement part out, next day delivery, no charge. And but that was it basically. From then on, he didn't really bother with any other vacuum cleaner manufacturers. It's amazing how you can achieve those really, and I don't think we look for them enough.
Yeah. Rory, what's your opinion? I'm curious to know, what is it that businesses can do to ensure long-term success? I mean, we talked a little bit about Labubu. Your friend Mark Ritson was in the news this week saying that maybe the wheels are starting to come off. How can they reignite the fame, the hype? But beyond all of these very, very, distinct cultural moments, what are the enduring features of businesses?
One thing only, and I only realized it about a month ago, which is the reason I became a bit famous, really, was very simple, which is that nearly and it was accidental. This is totally accidental. Right? So I ended up doing conferences and they started paying me a bit of money. And some of these conferences were nothing to do with marketing. Now, normally, because marketers weren't paid any money to do a conference, they only went to marketing conferences and they talked to other marketers. And the apotheosis of this being the Cannes Advertising Festival, where 1,000 people all descend on a French town, all to try and impress the same 47 people. It's utterly stupid, right? From a game theory point of view. So I ended up at conferences about sort of compliance. So I realized, I can't talk to these people about ads because they're never going to have the opportunity to run an ad. So I sold marketing and advertising, not on the basis of what we do, but on the basis of how we think. And I did that out of necessity, really, because it was like, well, a load of compliance people don't just want to watch a load of ads. They want to hear how, you can come up with ingenious solutions if you start with human psychology and work backwards, rather than starting with a product and pricing it and working forwards. And that's it, really. Mark Ritson calls it the magic 180-degree flip, that marketers do. And that's the most important thing we can do, which is to ask that question, actually, and also ask the opposite. So why would someone do this? But also the brilliant question that I think Tom helps us, which is what's stopping them? There are already a lot of people who would buy your product if there weren't some bottleneck or psychological obstacle to them doing it. If we can find out what that obstacle.
Oh, lost Rory very quickly. Tom, have you got a view on that? Anything that you would recommend businesses do to secure long-term success and continued success?
Yeah, so I kind of go back to a lot of what we've spoken about today is pretty much how Facebook grew. Now, I think it's kind of, there's a level of irony in terms of Facebook's growth, because if you go to Facebook today and say, how are you going to grow? Let's just say I'm going to start Tom's Gym tomorrow morning. They're going to say to me, right, let's find all, target gym goers in the UK and let's hit them with some advertising. And that's not going to work particularly well, right? When we understand that people are more likely to adopt based on people around us. I'd be better off starting a gym in one area and then growing that. And actually, the irony there is that's how Facebook started. They didn't launch a social media platform and say, right, let's try and target college students across North America on MySpace, whatever they would have used. They said, we are going to go really, really small. We're going to exploit this kind of web, these connections that exist in one university, one college, Harvard. They let that organically spread to other colleges, but they didn't let those people in until they reached a critical mass, on that, again, that diffusion curve. And they ran that playbook out. The problem is with a lot of brands today, I think they can be fooled by thinking, well, if we just try and reach our entire audience everywhere, we'll grow really quickly. But to Rory's point, sometimes growth can take a long time. So it's like actually by being strategic with these networks and thinking about how your customers are influencing each other, you hit these local diffusion points, these tipping points, and then they culminate in a national tipping point, and then they will eventually culminate in a global tipping point. So it's just having the time, it's understanding it takes a bit longer than you want, but also thinking about it strategically. The hard thing, I often believe this, is the problem is with that, it means you're making a conscious decision. So if things fail, it's on you. Whereas it's actually easier for people to say, well, Facebook recommend I just target everybody. So if I do that and it doesn't work, I can blame Facebook, right? Facebook's not working. Facebook's shit. Facebook isn't shit. It's got great
blame game
tactically, but we need to own our audiences as businesses, not outsource them. And I think that for me is the bit, if you're trying to go long term, what you should be thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've just lost Rory again, but hopefully he'll be able to join. I wanted to. A lot of the people who are doing this course, Tom, they're founders. They're in growth roles. Perhaps they're working at smaller brands. What is it that smaller brands with smaller budgets can do to actually sort of cut through? How might they use psychology or her behaviour to make smaller budgets go further?
My favorite phrase, I actually borrow this from one of our data science team, but you can't be the biggest brand in the world overnight, but you can be the biggest brand in a town overnight. So like I've just talked about that Facebook example, lean into where you're big and use that to grow. And again, it's a bit, think about the virus analogy, influence spreads to adjoining areas. I think sometimes we can be obsessed with new areas for the sake of new areas, and then when you have a little bit of success everywhere, you're just left touring like the small theaters, right? Go big, try and grow in these areas, let that spread. And what's brilliant there is the principle's the same whether you're trying to break out of the UK to the US or you're just trying to crack Kent or Hertfordshire. It's the same theory. You just scale it differently. And what I like about that is it's not about fundamentally thinking differently. It's just playing with that underlying influence that exists, playing to your favor with it. And me and Roy have talked a lot. I think you advocated that BT called themselves BT Kent, right, back in the day.
Yeah.
So
if you're doing broadband, if you're doing, I never persuaded them to do it, but I said if you're upgrading people's broadband, make the communication local. Because you'll get 10 times the attention. I mean, if I get an envelope with direct marketing, which has some, you don't have to do that daft personalization, which just looks obviously silly, like great news for everybody in the Sutherland household, but if you actually make it look locally relevant, everybody wants to know.
And Rory, it's that time of year when we're seeing the big guns, the John Lewis's, the Coca-Colas roll out their Christmas ads. I see John Lewis is trying to appeal to dads who have long since left the dance floor this year.
The chronology is actually slightly off, because to have listened to that music, that guy would have to be about 58. Either that or he was attending raves as a young teenager, which should have been technically illegal, I think. But can I just say, as a piece of copywriting, if you can't find the words, find the gift is like one for the ages. It's the execution was a bit alienating to me personally, but then I'm sure there are loads of dads for whom it chimes absolutely brilliantly. But then I'm an old guy
thought it was brilliant,
whose idea of fun isn't standing in a field shouting "woo," to be absolutely honest. But as a piece of copywriting, and they've done some radio advertising, by the way, which is similar, which is around that line: if you can't find the words, find the gift. And I would desperately hope, that line runs next year and the year after and the year after that, because actually we need a bit of rich what a lot of this Christmas advertising is missing is everybody produces a kind of Super Bowl-y ad, but it's lacking in ritual. And I think if you've got a line that good, just because
Roll it out, yeah.
that's literally a line that can launch 1,000 separate executions. It's
Didn't
just
they bring back
beautiful.
Never Knownly Undersold? Did that happen?
They have brought it. They have brought that back.
Yeah.
By the way, yeah.
But I mean, I'm curious, Rory. I mean, it's a tough task going up against Coca-Cola and John Lewis, at this sort of like crazy period. What have you seen? I know you always like looking at the slightly less obvious examples. Have you seen any great advertising of late where you just think that is a really smart thing to do on a small budget and it's cutting through?
There was one thing this year which I thought was never going to even come within 100 miles of Cannes, but it was from a very small agency, and I don't approve of it. I don't support the cause it supports, but it was bloody clever, which was an ad for Trump, the Trump election campaign, which simply said, Kamala Harris is for they, them, President Trump is for you. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I'm not, I'm not going to come across as a MAGA fan here, but I thought if we're being completely honest in our assessment of good communication, we ought to separate out. This gets obviously ethically dubious, but we ought to, one of the problems of the advertising industry is that two of the greatest campaigns of all time were for diamonds and Marlboro cigarettes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. But if we can separate out the quality of the persuasion from the cause, behind it, I always thought that was a really, really. I mentioned it to Graham Fink, and he thought the same thing. Okay, it was a small agency, nobody knows who the copywriter was, but that was bloody clever. Mm-hmm. That in one sentence. And the John Lewis thing, I also think is sensational. And actually, I prefer the radio ad I heard this morning on LBC to the TV ad, actually. But then that's we can produce. The great thing is, with a line like that, you can produce 27 radio ads, and 5 of them will really, really chime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've had a couple of questions through, and we'll move to that shortly. Still a chance to get a question in.
Oh, one more, by the way, which is old, but it's a brilliant bit of advertising somebody told me on Twitter, which you'll love as well, Tom, is when they launched Bumble, they decided to launch, as Facebook did, in university campuses. And they played the very, very clever trick of pretending we're much bigger than we really are. So nobody is using Bumble. But they put up notices around university campuses in places where you weren't really supposed to use your mobile phone. And they'd say, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Snapchat, no Twitter, no Bumble, with a big X next to them. And everybody thought, well, I've heard of the other 4 and I use them every day. What the hell's this Bumble thing?
Must be big. Yeah.
It must be big. Yeah. And so another idea was a kind of web van delivery service. It was an internet delivery service in San Francisco. It subsequently went bust, but it was still a very clever idea, where the media agency just said, the best thing we can do is make you seem really big in San Francisco. So they said there are hundreds of people driving around San Francisco in unbranded vans, and if you pay them a few $1,000s a month, they'll brand your van as if they're delivering your stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So effectively, these people are actually plumbers or carpenters or whatever. They could have been anything, right? But they basically, everybody in San Francisco is going, who the hell are these guys? Because I see their vans everywhere. Really clever.
I liken that to, you don't want to play Wembley Stadium if you're a band too early, because if 500 people turn up to Wembley Stadium, everyone goes, this is shit.
It's over.
If you play to a stadium that can take 400 people and 500 people turn up,
brilliant.
Amazing. Exactly the same kit set, exactly the same number of people, but it's the perception and that focus. And I think, Roy, that Bumble trick, I wonder if they riffed off what Red Bull famously did by leaving empty, they fill rubbish bins up outside nightclubs full of Red Bull. So everyone leaving went, oh,
everyone's drinking Red Bull.
But what am I missing?
Lovely.
Brilliant.
Absolutely fantastic.
Nice. Let's try a question. So we've got one on the platform. I'm not entirely sure who it's from, but it says, how can herd effects be leveraged with non-physical products like mobile apps? Most mobile apps are used privately, i.e. not visible usage to others. Is this a silly question, or not?
No, it's not. No, it's a brilliant question. And it always relates to the fact that Mark Earls, who wrote the book Herd, always pointed out that there were some products which were immune to herd effects, of which I think hemorrhoid cream came kind of top of the list.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to go, this is fine. Okay. But there are certain things which are consumed privately, and apps are really interesting. Now, obviously, you do have some social proof in terms of if you've got a good search optimization thing for your app, and it says there are a certain number of users. Now, it doesn't have to be, apparently. The difference between 1 million and 100,000 isn't that big in terms of how people perceive that. But the difference between 407 and 14,000 is quite big in terms of things like number of reviews. So you can amplify those effects. Very, very interesting point. I mean, you're absolutely right that certain things tend to be privately consumed. Now, obviously, you can incentivize materially or financially advocacy. You can also do something which just, I mean, I suppose, Monzo did that slightly clever thing of just making the card coral. Now, okay, that's a card that's physically used, but most of the time people are paying on a phone, but it's still a bit more noticeable. There was a whole book by Seth Godin called Purple Cow about this, which was effectively building in gratuitous visibility into your product. I accept the fact that with some apps it's going to be difficult unless they have a social component to them.
Tom, you got a take on that?
Yeah, I obviously wouldn't disagree with anything there. I think the thing I'd add is I think people think we use things in private a lot less than we actually do, or a lot more than we actually do. Like I'm going to take a sharp turn here, but sex toys. I think if I look at the Rabbit back in the 2000s, I know, people think they deliver it in brown boxes so people can't see it. People think we're prudish as Brits, we don't talk about it. Yet the Rabbit just got this huge adoption in the 2000s. I knew people at school or college who would talk about it. Like these things that we think are private, I think what's actually happens is we talk about them in different contexts. You don't walk into the pub and go, guess what I've ordered? But you might
it's my Germaloid.
Right. So, and I think that's the same with a lot of apps. Like, let's face it, there are how many millions of apps in the App Store? Discovery is mostly because your mates go, do you know what? I've been using this app recently and it's been quite cool, right? Most apps I have on my phone, not because I've browsed for apps, I've had a good recommendation. And I think people talk about apps more than we think we do.
Interesting point, by the way, not a bad one on which to end, is that one of the defining moments probably with sex toys was when Boots started stocking them. All right. So in other words, they were always sold by discrete retailers, and they started going mainstream in terms of the retail channels. Now, the example I've always given here, and I've said this to everybody, including Greg Jackson at Octopus Energy, I go, there is a fundamental problem here, analogous to the sex toy problem, with solar panels, which is the moment I go into a branch of John Lewis and there's a display of solar panels, everything changes because it's social proof by implication, if you like. And so, one of the things I've said to the solar panel people is, look, you've got to stop, you've got to get yourself out of this rut of like weird distribution channels where, you basically have to Google an installer, then a weird company you've never heard of supplies some panels made by a company you've never heard of. Retail can do a fantastic job of just normalizing something.
We've had one question about client briefs and how we might improve them. So this person asked, do you think there's a role for in-house agencies in improving client briefs, and any recommendations to get a brief that is simpler, clearer, and enabling creative distinctiveness?
That's really, I mean, first of all, have you defined the problem? Because the great thing about, the great debate we've got to have about AI is it might be very, very interesting, but if you're asking the wrong question, if you're starting from the wrong place, it will just get you to the wrong answer faster. And I think that, that think like a marketer thing of what's really happening here, is the obstacle that nobody's ever heard of it? Is the obstacle that people think it's weird? What's, actually starting from that point of view of what's the negative we're trying to remove, I think is really, really useful. But in terms of really interesting briefs, the interesting question there is, I think, probably the real value you can do there is to actually redefine the question. That's when you got somewhere, and you redefine the question in a more interesting way. And the other thing I think is that probably we prize linearity a little too much. That sometimes advertising, goes, it doesn't really answer the brief, but it's going to make you famous. And my argument would be, look, fame is really, really valuable. It's not necessarily easy to quantify, but being famous just changes the rules of the game. And I've actually said one of the problems I have with this obsession with tight brief thing is that there are also loose things that ad agencies do, which we never talk about because they seem too banal. So if you come in, you don't want to say, look, we'll make you really famous and then you'll make a lot more money, because it doesn't make you sound very clever. So instead you say, well, we're going to do some bottom of the funnel optimization experiments using A/B testing and da-da-da-da-da. And I sometimes wonder if one of the things we lose is just actually, let's not make every brief an answer to a precise question with a really narrowly defined objective. Let's sometimes take some time out and go, are there any broad objectives we can just achieve here?
A bit of creative license.
It's the same problem, which is you can't say, look, if I were you, I'd put a dog in your advertising, because it just makes you feel childish.
Tom, any view on that?
Yeah, I'm not an ad guy, right? So I'm probably not qualified to talk too much on that. I think the only thing I'd add, and I think this will never happen because this is a long-term view, but including in there, how can we get people talking about us? Not in a shocking, gratuitous way, but like, how can we build a long-term conversation? The problem is, you put that in a brief, someone at the top can say, well, how do we measure if people are talking about us, right? That's a long-term payoff. These are networks. But if you could think about how do we get people talking about us, that transcends the organization. I think there's
actually, I'd also say that everybody's copying their metrics from everybody else.
Yeah.
And if you have the same metrics as everybody else, you end up the same as everybody else, which is a really bad place to be. And actually, what we ought to do is occasionally say, if you're going to be a brand, you've got to have some metrics which are exclusively yours. So the only time, the best example of this was, I was talking to this thing called The Local in San Antonio in Texas, which is these little 6-person electric cars, which basically take people around town for free. And they're ad funded, and they're also funded because bars and nightclubs pay to have a stop outside because it brings them traffic. And one of the metrics we decided on was, it's a slightly silly, weird form of transport. We said, why don't we make the metric the percentage of times in any 20-minute period where one of the passengers laughs? Because you're only going to succeed by making this funny. It's never going to be a serious mode of transport. It will be eventually, maybe, but in the first 10 years of its existence, everybody's going to be going, oh, this is a bit funny. And actually, I said, maybe that's a metric. You try and make the passengers laugh.
Maybe they'll be buzzing around 7 Oaks before we know it, Rory.
And actually, what the digital world's done is it's made the metrics that everybody uses the metrics that make Meta and Alphabet rich. Okay, so it's encouraged. This is what technoplasmosis is. It's encouraged everybody to assess themselves on the extent to which they're enriching Meta and Alphabet by their marketing activity, but they haven't noticed this. One of the great metrics is, how can we actually promote ourselves without a large proportion of the resulting gains being paid to Meta and Alphabet? Which is probably either it's what Herdify do, it's what influencer marketing does. It's bypassing the gatekeepers rather than being slightly more efficient at bribing the gatekeeper.
Yeah. On that, and I know we're conscious of time, but just a quick point. I've got young children, as I've said, and it's interesting. It was actually at Nudge Talk 2 years ago. Jonathan Haidt spoke, the anxious generation, and I'm sitting there as a father of 2 girls, hearing this professor talking about how teen suicide is on the rise, correlated with social media. The grassroots activity on young kids going against social media has been crazy in the last 2 years. I think my children and my children's generation and the generations below are going to have a very different relationship with social media in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
I think that platform is going to be very different for brands. Now, again, for me, the long-term thinking, if I was owning a consumer brand, I'd be thinking about how do I build my future without reliance on those platforms? Because I think that is going to change very rapidly and blindside a lot of people. Unfortunately, as we've talked about a lot today, that's long-term thinking. Most CMOs they're not given the runway to go, what platform, what's going to happen to these platforms in 5-10 years? How do we remove our reliance? Because if you start thinking about how you remove your reliance when everyone else is thinking about that, you're caught up in the
Too late.
Too
late.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. Thank you, gents. That was a great call. We're back again tomorrow, Rory, I believe. So anybody who's here, do sharpen your questions, getting ready for tomorrow's session. Tom, thank you very, very much. I think that was really great to hear your insights as ever. We'll see you again soon. And happy birthday, Rory.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks ever so much, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.